Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another one of our Free Friday community classes right here on the Green Art channel. This week, I'm excited to be talking with you about something that I don't think we've ever really tackled before. We've definitely done classes on meditation and mindfulness and organoleptic sort of sensory engagements, but this week we are talking about contemplative plant spirit work. And this is sort of a diversion from our usual content because generally I really focus on the fact that what we do in this work is more important than what we think, right? And this comes, of course, from our ancient pagan forebears that our ritual actions, our actions of kinship and sacred reciprocity carry more weight and mean more in the grand scope of things than really what we believe or what we think. How we show up always is going to have more of an impact on the world than what's happening sort of internally. But this week, I want to talk about how what happens internally can still be transformative and can still really add something special to our connection with the plants. So much of what we do is this really physical engagement, these rituals, being out in nature, sitting with plants, and there is room for the contemplative. So I'm just going to share some points today, just some things that are on my mind, and maybe give you a little insight into how contemplative practices are part of, a percentage of my overall plant spirit work, in and of itself. So, a couple of things when I talk about contemplative work in this context, I mean contemplating, right? Pondering, thinking about, processing, picking apart something. And sometimes it's a more intentional kind of analysis based process, and sometimes it's more just a gentle, free form thing. And that's what I try to do. My brain definitely wants me to analyze everything. So it's always a practice for me in strength training to just get into more of a flow zone, right? More of a flow state with things. I also think about meditation as being a very contemplative act, especially when meditation is happening on an idea or on a concept or on an experience, or in our case for this conversation, on a plant, right? That if we're sitting and just simply meditating on the way that a plant shows up, that can be a very contemplative experience. And even if it's engaging our senses, our physical senses, our other senses, the brain and the faculties of analysis and contemplation are still activated, at least for me. So I think about adding meditation, um, making connections, looking at patterns, looking at how certain actions cause certain reactions, how certain things are linked in the great web of the universe that we all live in. This can be kind of a fun, rabbit hole to go down. And again, for those of us with a proclivity to overanalyze and overthink, we have to be mindful that there's a point where making connections and sort of contemplating how things fit together and how things connect can turn into sort of a little bit of a hamster wheel. And we have to avoid that because I don't think it's helpful to run in circles. Um, Perspective shifts, contemplative work helps us think about how we see and perceive things now, and then think about how others, especially in our work, the plant spirits, might experience, perceive, see and engage with the world. It can be an act of empathy, but it can also be an act of changing our consciousness, like gently shifting into altered states of consciousness or into alternative perspectives that give us an angle into things that we might not have otherwise had. And I think that's very, very valuable in this work where we are human folk trying to engage with non-human folk, right? These perspective shifts are crucial because we're engaging with people who don't have the same perspective as us. In fact, their perspective is often radically different. And I think the last thing would just be cultivating awareness, right? Contemplative practice for me is about expanding and engaging awareness, being aware of what is happening, how things are, And rather than going into daydreaming or fantasy, really just contemplating the way of things, how plants show up, how they engage, how spaces feel, how I feel in spaces. All of that can engage the contemplative muscles and really help onboard our thinking brain in a path that, if you've been around here for very long, I constantly drill into people that the green art, the plant spirit path as I practice it, work coming in general, I think is a heart centered path, right? It's something that should happen from here, from the thinking perspective space of the heart. But there is room for the brain, there is room for the head, just as there's room for the hands, right? Like all parts of being can be engaged at this. We just always focus on the heart. So this is just a little bit of a divergent from what we usually do. So there are many benefits to contemplative plant spirit work, just like there are many benefits to any contemplative practice. And the first thing I think about is contemplation of anything brings us into the moment. It engages us so much with what is happening and how things are, that it sort of forces us to step fully into the moment. And we talk a lot in herbal practice about how anxiety tends to live in the future, like when we sit in future trip and worry about what's next, and depression lives in the past when we sit and ruminate on things that have happened before. And so when we sort of land in the moment, we find a little bit of relief. We find a little bit of freedom from these depressive and anxiety states, from these worries and rumination states. And that in and of itself can be incredibly therapeutic. At least it is for me. This is one of the things that I benefit most from contemplative practice is that it sort of invites me into what's real, right into the eternal moment, and that's really important. Another big thing is that contemplative practices really invite us and show us how to go with the flow, how to be with things as they are rather than as we might want them to be or as we might have expected them to be, and even to let go of things in the past that didn't turn out the way we wanted them to turn out, right? It's sort of like um, sitting and contemplating the flow of a river and just acknowledging the facts that things move the way they move sometimes, and we are oftentimes more than we really think, not the biggest force in a movement, right? Humans, I think we tend to think that in most cases we are the biggest factor of influence. We're the strongest arm, in the situation. And there are many examples of cases that I'm sure you could come up with where that's not the case. No matter how loud you were, how hard you pushed, how strongly you fought, there were other forces that caused that river to move just in a different direction. And I think contemplative work invites us to let go of the judgment, the guilt, the shame, the resentment, the what ifs, and to just say, this is where it went. I showed up how I could show up. And there's something that I find really freeing in that, really good. Um, for folks who do engage with more ritualized practices, which I think is really important in all of this, that sacred reciprocity does require showing up. It can help us be more mindful and intentional in the things we do. So rather than our rituals being these kind of hollow reproductions of somebody else's recipe or somebody else's ritual, or these things where we're so concerned about correct performance that we've lost the heart of the matter, it's contemplative practice. It's being mindful, it's attentiveness that allows us to kind of drop into the deep heart of ritual. So mindfulness for me is very important. And when I do ritual works, especially if I'm going to be doing them with our working group or in a public setting and there are other people involved, I will spend time in the days leading up to that event going through the ritual piece by piece in my head, kind of laying out a map, laying out a game plan, getting some muscle memory so that in the moment I can be more present. I can drop down into my heart and be more heart centered because my mind, my brain already knows the plan, right? Already knows it. Again, we have to be open to things going in different ways than we expect, but we always leave, with an intent, with the way that we want to go. So I want to tell you about three of my favorite ways to engage in contemplative plant spirit practice. The first is just going for walks, going outside, walking around the block, walking around a park, going hiking, whatever you have access and ability to do. Walking is a really simple way to drop into your whole person, the wholeness of yourself, and to try to just follow your senses. How do I feel? What do I smell? What do I see? What do I hear? How do I feel in this space? How do I feel differently in this other space? How do I feel like this space might be responding to me? When we get into plant identification and all of that, we're also using contemplation because oftentimes we're sitting with a plant, looking at their various morphologies, how they grow, when they grow, their leaf structure, their flower structure, and contemplating, who is this plant? Who is this person that I'm sitting with? And that gets a little more analytical, but I still think there's an invitation to engage the organoleptic, right? To use contemplative practices to sharpen the senses, to go further in, like, yes, that is a green leaf. But what if we were to sit down and let the entire world around us fade away so that only that leaf is in our focus? Suddenly we start to see patterns, textures, variations in color. Maybe we start picking up on a scent. Maybe there's a taste that we can connect with. Maybe we start to see the different animals and insects who are, gathering around that plant and living there or eating there or finding medicine there, right? So without a contemplative practice, we would miss all of that. We would analyze the plant, we would define it and move on. We would not engage the whole person. And that's really important because whole person engagement is heart center engagement, right? That's very big part of this work. Another thing, you could onboard contemplative practices with charms and lore and plant stories and mythology. Rather than just reading it, we can stop and contemplate. What does this mean? Why this word? Why this plant? When they say this, what might they have meant by that? And contemplating the whole spirit of the charm rather than just the words. And this is a really big part of my practice because I geek out really hard over the old English herbals, right? So while I'm reading those recipes and formulas and charms and things, I'm also saying, what could this have meant to the people who wrote this? And what can it mean to those of us living right now? And that contemplative practice is meditative. It brings us into the moment and engages us with the deep spirit of the plants in a way that we'll miss if we just read things in this kind of factual, analytical way. Um, the last thing that I will leave here, and I think this is probably the most important and more important thing and effective thing, is organoleptic experiences. Making space for the senses to be engaged in a more direct and sharpened and focused way. That when we smell a plant, we go deeply into the scent. What is that scent? What other plants smell like that? What does that bring up for me? What does that remind me of? What alkaloids or volatile oils might be active in this plant, causing this particular scent? The taste as well, the texture, the pattern, the colors, all of these aspects of plants are communication. How a plant shows up in the world is something of the plant showing themselves to us. The way they show up, where they grow, their colors, their patterns, their textures, their tastes, their scent, where they move in the body, their energetics. All of that is just one of the many aspects of plant language, one of the many ways they tell us something about their mysteries. So when we sit down with that and we engage and we say, I'm going to go deeply into the scent of this plant, I'm going to journey deeply into the taste of this plant, then we are contemplating the presence of the plant. We're contemplating the way that plant shows up in the world. And we're also engaging the heart at the same time because wherever that meeting point happens between our receptive senses and the projective expression, the morphology of the plant, it's a liminal point, right? It's a place where our world and their world start to overlap. And there's always an activation of the heart in those moments. So you get kind of a 2 for 1 in that type of contemplative work. So from meditation to creative visualization, pondering the myth and the lore, going on mindful walks and hikes, to going deeply into the organoleptic expressions of the plants. Contemplative work is such a beautiful part of the plant spirit journey. And while we focus so much on the heart in the way that I teach this and practice it, don't forget about your head. See you next time.